October 7, 1982, 1:43 a.m., Emporia, Kansas. A northbound delivery driver topped the crest past milepost 287 on Old Highway 50, the Sunoco canopy glowing like a raft on black water. Inside the glass booth, the register drawer slid shut. The clerk glanced toward the dark backlot. In the 1:47 a.m. radio log, Emporia PD noted Unit 12 clearing a prior traffic assist near County Road J. At 2:06, the dispatcher marked, "No further." What happened to the 3 men on that shift? 40 years later, a contractor would uncover something no blueprint admitted. Until then, the town slept. The ground kept the rest, patient as a locked jaw. They were ordinary men with unordinary timing, the kind of crew a small town trusted to hold the night together. Aaron Vale, 30 and steady, wore the title of shift lead the way he wore his jacket, zipped to the throat, snug against the draft that slipped under the door. He'd fixed the sputtering coffee maker before midnight, counted the till twice, and left a note for the morning manager in a square, careful print that always made his younger sister smile. Ricky Calder, 21, quick with a joke, had once told his mother the graveyard shift was like borrowing time no one else will use. He was saving for a rusted Ford he swore he could resurrect in a month. Joel Harper, 26, new in town and quieter than the others, had the look of a man learning to fit his life into a single backpack. He knew engines and how to keep them from lying. He'd been hired because he didn't flinch. The night felt stretched, a tight drum kind of quiet, the November-bound wind already in the leaves though the calendar clung to October. They filled the monotony with small rituals, wiping pump handles, rotating display chips, a second pot of coffee that steamed the booth's window and drew a finger-traced smiley from Ricky. Aaron logged meter readings on a clipboard, checked them twice, then turned the dial of the radio to a station that still played songs about leaving and coming home. Joel did a slow walk around the perimeter with a flashlight, beams skating along chain link, gravel, the slick black tongue of the alley that led to the backlot. He paused there, listening the way you listen to the ocean in a shell. Just the transformer hum and a semi grinding down to the light at Prairie Street. Nothing else. He clicked the light off and on again, as if to remind the darkness whose turn it was. At 1:43, a driver in a brown jacket eased up to pump 3 and paid cash, bills folded twice and warm from his palm. He thought the clerk at the counter, Ricky, was polite but distracted. Twice, the kid looked over his shoulder toward the door that led to the storage bay, like he was waiting for someone to come back out. The driver signed the receipt without looking at it, caught his reflection in the booth glass, and moved on, taillights shrinking to beads. Inside, the register tape curled like a paper snake. Ricky tore it free, smoothed it flat, and said something under his breath that neither of the others heard. What people remember afterward is always the way morning refuses to negotiate. At 6:10 a.m., the opening clerk pulled into the lot and saw every light still burning. She told police later that it struck her as hopeful at first, as if, for once, the world had stayed awake for her. Inside, the coffee in the glass pot had gone from brown to mud and left a ring like a tide mark. 3 jackets hung on the pegboard. 3 pay envelopes lay unopened on the desk, lined up with the precision of a coin roll. The till sat open, cash accounted for. There was no broken glass, no kicked-in door, no slosh of panic left behind. The back storage door wasn't splintered. It was simply unlatched, as if someone had stepped through with their hands full and intended to step right back. The first patrol officer walked the lot, his boots scuffing out and back in a patient ellipse. He logged his presence with dispatch at 6:22, asked for the last known unit near Old 50, then requested a contact number for the owner. He said the words people say when the room tells them nothing. Maybe they clocked out wrong, maybe someone gave them a ride home. He wrote it in his notebook too. Words have to go somewhere. He didn't know that a sister a mile away would already be sitting on the edge of a bed, reading a note about the coffee maker, and wondering why her brother hadn't come home to argue about the thermostat. He didn't know that a mother 2 streets over had a new set of keys in her hand, the kind you give a son when you decide to trust him with your house and your heart. He didn't know that inside a rented room above a shuttered post office, a duffel bag sat open with a clean shirt neatly rolled on top, a small act of optimism waiting for its turn. The owner arrived at 9:11, breath showing in the air, coat thrown on over pajamas. He unlocked the office and pulled the ledger with the air of a man who believes in arithmetic more than luck. Nothing was missing. Not money, not parts, not gas from the underground tanks. If anything, the numbers pressed the question harder. He walked to the back and ran his thumb over the metal hasp where the storage door's slide bolt should have been catching. The wood showed no tear. The bolt lay warm from the sun in the dust, as if it had been set there and not dropped. He picked it up and didn't say what he thought. He understood that some observations are best added to the ledger inside your chest. By noon, the rumor mill had broken into its reliable gears. A fight. A prank. A woman. Tulsa. Amarillo. The stories shook themselves dry and spread in the sun as if that could make them true. Families filed missing persons reports because that is what families do when the morning doesn't give them back what the night borrowed. An officer wrote, "No sign of struggle, and voluntary departure cannot be ruled out." The file got a case number, a drawer, a thin breath of air as it shut. And yet the town felt a pressure change. Something had leaned into their lives and left no fingerprint, just the memory of a weight. In the margins of people's days, in the half moment before a door clicks shut, the question stayed. What happened between 1:43 a.m. and the moment the sun insisted on itself? Noah Vale was halfway through packing a borrowed U-Haul when his phone lit with an Emporia number he hadn't seen since the funeral. His cousin Lydia didn't say hello. She said, "They're tearing up Old 50 for a parking lot," and the backhoe hit steel. He could hear wind in the receiver and the faint clatter of a site radio. "Sheriff's here." They pulled up a hatch that isn't on any plans. The word hatch landed like a coin dropped down a well, ringing longer than it should. Lydia lowered her voice. "Dad says the county's sealing it off." "No, they found a room." He had a rule about the past. Keep it boxed, keep it labeled, keep it somewhere you don't trip over it at midnight. But Emporia had a way of pressing a thumb into old bruises. He turned the truck around and watched the interstate measure out a decision he'd been avoiding for 40 years. The closer he came, the flatter the land grew, the horizon a clean line he could read like a monitor. It struck him, not for the first time, that out there you could see a storm coming for miles and still be surprised by the first cold drop. The worksite sat where the Sunoco once threw a trapezoid of yellow light onto the highway. Now the canopy was a rusted rib cage and the slab was cracked into islands. The construction crew had cleared a ring of earth around a square mouth set in concrete, a modern bolt-on lid already fitted by the county. Yellow tape snapped in the breeze. A deputy stood at the perimeter, boots planted in crushed limestone, arms crossed like a gate. In the distance, the low rumble of a generator bent the light, made the heat look like it was breathing. Noah parked on the shoulder, signed a narrow waiver the clerk held like it could burn her, and walked toward the mouth. Even with the July sun bright on his neck, the air rising from the opening felt cellar cool and dry, like paper stored too long. He took the ladder one rung at a time, counting the space with his hands, listening for the way rooms sound when they're done remembering. The beam from his flashlight found corners without shelves, a ceiling hook without a purpose, the salt-white bloom of old concrete along a seam. Near the ladder, a smear of marker, the number 4, faint as if the wall wanted it gone. At the baseboard, metal anchors rusted where something had once held. He swept the light back and caught the evidence bag on a temporary stand. Inside, a bent name tag stamped Ahutville, a sunflower state lighter with a blackened hinge, a digital watch frozen at 1:57 a.m. He waited for his heartbeat to choose a pace that wasn't all history. He didn't touch the bag. He didn't say his uncle's name. He let each object write its short sentence in the room. The watch spoke first. It told him that time could stop and take something with it and that the rest of the world might not notice. The lighter said he had been a boy once, that he had a porch and fireworks and laughed when they flared. The name tag said he belonged to this place and had been known here, for Aaron, not for absence. Noah felt, sharply and without permission, how much of his life had been arranged around that unspoken letter. Back on the surface, the deputy asked if he'd gotten what he needed, and Noah told the truth, "I don't know yet." He could feel Lydia watching him from the shade of the equipment trailer, her hands sunk into the pockets of a hoodie too warm for the heat. She'd called because she knew what the silence had cost their family, how it frayed conversations and shortened holidays and made people count chairs at Thanksgiving. She didn't ask what he would do. She knew the word reporter meant something more stubborn in him than a job title. He looked past her at the old lot where they'd ridden bikes as kids while their mothers smoothed grief into chores, and he tried to imagine the town that had decided to live with a locked door under its feet. He rented a room at the Blue Stem Motor Lodge because that's where visiting relatives always slept, a habit that let memory feel practical. He set his recorder on the table, then left it there, like a promise made to an empty chair. He called the county records office and listened to the clerk talk about permits and pipeline diagrams and light files, with a tone people reserve for recipes that leave too much out. He called the sheriff's office and got the professional version of patience. He called his mother and didn't speak when she answered. When she finally said, "Noah," he heard both the boy and the man in his name braided together. That night, he drove back to the site and watched the stars hang a kind of ledger over the fields. There is a moment in every investigation when curiosity changes weight, when it stops being about answers and starts being about the people who deserve them. He thought of Aaron's square handwriting, of Lydia's voice thinning in the wind, of the 3 jackets on the pegboard from a morning that never ended. He thought of how stories survive not because they are tidy, but because they put a hand on your shoulder and say, "Don't leave me here." He knew better than to ask for anyone's attention, but he also knew that journeys like this move differently when people walk beside you, even if all they carry is the willingness to see. If you're still here, he thought, stay. Not for me. For the men who didn't get to clock out, and for the one truth the town avoided naming. He slid the waiver into his pocket like a talisman and looked at the square of steel set back into the earth, feeling, clear as rain, the next door waiting somewhere nearby. The room had given him 3 sentences. The rest of the paragraph was buried in the dark. He wasn't alone when the wind changed. The old precinct smelled like lemon oil and paper, a scent that made Noah think of sermons and late apologies. Shane Whitaker met him in a narrow office lined with binders whose spines had gone pale from sunlight. He'd been 26 in 1982, raw and stubborn, and his face held both the stubborn and the years. Whitaker poured coffee into a chipped mug, added nothing to it, and slid a folder across the desk as if finally granting a parole. "I wrote this the week they pulled me off," he said. "Didn't fit the story they needed." Inside were photocopies of his notes, the handwriting tidy, the language careful in the way that tells you it's covering for anger. He had circled a line on the first page twice. "Feels like something under the slab." They went through it slow. The initial canvas, meter logs, the interview with owner Carl Benton taped on a handheld recorder that clicked before it caught his voice. Benton's sentences were the kind that come from men who trust bolts more than people. He described a winter in '75 when a sump froze, how the crew chipped ice and found a patch of concrete that didn't match the rest. Poured later, Benton said on tape, the words small and flat, like he wanted them to pass unnoticed. He noted that the back storage door had been unlatched, not broken. "Somebody opened it like they had hands," Whitaker murmured, not hiding the bite. 12 days after the men vanished, a fire burned the utility shed down to ribs. The marshal's report called the cause undetermined, but the photos didn't care about the word. Whitaker tapped one with a forefinger. The latch on the shed's door had been pried before the burn. The angle of the metal told the story of leverage, not heat. A neighbor told a patrolman about a dark sedan idling by the fence an hour before the first smoke, and that line never made it into the official summary. The file was thin in the wrong places, thick where it didn't matter. Noah felt a pressure in his jaw he recognized from funerals. The body is gone, but the weight remains. In the county archive, a volunteer named Elise who wore a cardigan the color of cardinals found a box labeled Facilities, Cameras, 1980 to 1983. The 8mm reel inside had a penciled tag, 2, and the brittle optimism of tape that survived floods by accident. They threaded it onto a machine that smelled faintly of museum glue and watched the rear lot come alive in gray. Midnight to 1:50 a.m., nothing but shadows and the sway of the pole light, a moth's erratic geometry. At 1:52, a man stepped into frame, big across the shoulders, coat dark as the sky. He faced the back of the building and didn't move, as if listening to ground. He left the way a sentence leaves a throat, without a trace. A few minutes later, a second figure slid low along the gravel, then dropped into a mouth in the earth that the camera recognized before Noah did. A shape like a recess, like a hatch ajar. The film kept counting time until 2:05, then failed as if the night had taken the rest. No one climbed out. Elise, who had the steady voice of people who file truth for a living, found him another thread. A carbon copy of a 1979 invoice billed to the station's rear lot, reinforced concrete, 2 truckloads, noted for Restricted Work Order 842 Restrict. No contractor name on the header, just a phone number that a reverse directory tied to Pritchard and Low Contracting out of Topeka. The firm dissolved in 1986 after an illegal dumping case that left lovely words like remediation and consent decree in the newspaper. In the margin, a clerk from that year had written, paid in cash, and underlined it twice. Whitaker set his jaw and didn't comment. Some facts asked to be left alone long enough to show their teeth. Noah spent the afternoon with blueprints that outlived men and arguments. A stormwater layout from 1951 mapped a secondary access cutting under what would become the Sunoco pad, closed in 1963, the note said, unsealed. In faint red pencil, not part of the printed plan, someone had drawn a circle east of the main building and written, with a contractor's impatience, do not dig. He placed a sheet of tracing paper over the map and aligned it with parcel lines, feeling a strange elation that always felt wrong to admit. How discovery can masquerade as joy even when it wears grief's clothes. When the light thinned, he drove to the fence behind the lot where the film had shown the man standing still as a survey stake. Gravel gave under his boots with a sound like dry rice. He let his breath slow until the generator hum from the construction site braided into the insect choir and then into his pulse. It was a simple exercise he'd learned reporting from scenes where the ground argued with the story. Make your body quiet enough to hear what remains. The wind crawled along the chain link and carried a scent he wanted to call dust but couldn't. He pictured a bolt sliding back, a hand lowering a latch like an apology, a door that refused to remember which side was inside. Back at the motel, he spread the notes on the bedspread, each page a rung on a ladder leading down. He marked times on an index card, 1:43, 1:52, 2:05, 6:10, and understood that hours are not neutral. They change when you hold them up to what people didn't do. He thought of Lydia's voice in the wind, of Whitaker's careful fury, of Benton's quiet admission about concrete poured where it shouldn't be. He fell asleep with the Sim 2 image in his head, the moment the earth seemed to open just enough to swallow certainty. Morning would bring a voice from 1982 he didn't know still existed. Noah found the box by accident, or that's what he told himself to keep from admitting how often the past places itself where you'll trip over it. His aunt kept the attic door half stuck with paint, and the old pull cord shed a little powder when he tugged. Heat pressed down on him, a dry breath full of cedar and thyme. He made space with his knees among quilts and holiday lights until he saw the crate wedged behind an iron bed frame. It had Aaron's name on the lid in the square hand he remembered from notes on the fridge, the same hand that once labeled a jar of screws, just in case. The marker had faded to the color of tea, but the letters still held their shape like a promise that refused to blur. Inside lay the artifacts of a life that expected a future, a Sunoco patch, a baseball cap sweated white along the brim, a Polaroid of 3 men in blue work shirts, arms folded, the pump island in the back like a stage. Aaron stood in the center, smiling with his mouth and not his eyes. Ricky's shoulder leaned in as if he'd always leaned toward people he loved. Joel's chin tipped up a fraction, defiant in the way shy men get when a lens judges them. Noah held the photo closer to the attic bulb and noticed the garage door yawning behind them. At the far edge, almost lost in glare, a precise rectangle cut into concrete. It seemed too crisp to be a crack. Beside the rectangle, just within the shadow, a shoe he wouldn't have clocked if memory hadn't trained him to be petty with details. Black leather, polished to a tidy shine, the toe pointed in, dress style, wrong for a place that smelled like oil and rubber and coffee. He found the receipt folded between a pay stub and a postcard Aaron never mailed. Anderson Hardware, September 29, 1982. 1 flashlight, 1 can of lubricant, 1 hook and hinge kit. The cash total had been pressed with a heavy pen. On the back, written slantwise as if it needed to get itself out before somebody walked in, a set of instructions that made Noah's skin lift. For steps left from light. Tap twice, then push. 12 in for down. Numbers lie. Names don't. If it's not shut, don't go in. He heard Aaron's voice as he read it without wanting to. Warm, practical, more careful with warnings than with praise. The phrase about names bent through him until it rang against the bent name tag he'd seen in the evidence bag. Veil stamped as if a press had insisted he'd always belonged to a shift, a station, a town. The cassettes were tucked inside a manila envelope labeled OCT, NO spare. He didn't trust the tape deck in his aunt's living room, not with its habit of chewing songs to ribbons, so he drove them to the community college lab where an adjunct he'd known a lifetime ago still had a machine that hummed like a refrigerator and smelled like school. Side A clicked into life under static. Ricky's voice crowded the tiny speaker, words low and quick the way you talk when you're not sure who might be listening. He described checking the storage drain after a rain, the thought that a crawlspace had been sealed, how Joel kept saying he heard a hum like a generator but nowhere to plug it in. He joked once about owing Aaron a beer if he was wrong and then, mid-breath, stopped joking. On side B, the room seemed to tilt. Footsteps multiplied, scuffed, turned. A metal latch groaned like a door waking. Joel's voice came thin and tight through the magnetic haze. It's not empty. Silence took a shape you could almost see. Then a rhythm, faint, a clicking that could have been water or could have been something that learned to sound like water. Ricky whispered, shut up, which is how people pray when they aren't ready to use the other words. And then a voice that didn't belong to any of them tested the edge of the tape. Mechanical soft, human enough to make you lean closer, it asked once, and then again, did you come back for me? The crash that followed wasn't dramatic, it was desperate, hand on metal, breath dragged sharp, the sound of bodies finding their limits. The tape ended in a long, flat line of hiss. Noah held the recorder away from his chest and listened to the air between them, the scrape of a chair, the lab clock deciding what a second is. He needed one more witness, not for the file but for the way stories lean on a living voice. Georgia Lane opened her door with a walker and a gaze that had watched this town survive itself more than once. She had phoned the station around midnight that night in '82, looking for a purse she thought she'd left by the candy rack. A man answered, she said, and the way she shaped the word man told Noah this part had never changed. Not a boy. The voice said he'd look. She paused and stared past him toward the porch swing that creaked whether you used it or not. There was a noise behind him, metal on metal, quick, like somebody telling somebody else not to start. Then a voice farther off, a man again, scared. He said, don't, and the line went dead. She took his hand as if no one had taken it in a while and added, almost apologizing, I didn't want to sound foolish back then. On the drive back to the motel, the tape's question rode shotgun, simple as a child's and colder than a basement. Did you come back for me? Noah parked beneath the sodium lamp and watched the light stutter while the phrase arranged his thoughts like furniture. He'd spent years avoiding the kind of story that takes your name and says it back to you. Now he understood what the attic, the shoe, the note, the voice were doing, drawing a circle around a person he could not stop being. Something else waited under the concrete, and it had learned to listen. Noah went back at night because the dark is honest about what it can hide. He climbed down the ladder into the concrete room and stood still long enough for his breath to match the silence. The number 4 by the ladder looked smaller than before, as if the wall had been trying to learn a different answer. He took Aaron's note from his pocket and read it twice, not like a code, but like a voice that knew how to get back into places it should have left alone. For steps left from light. Tap twice, then push. 12 in for down. Numbers lie. Names don't. If it's not shut, don't go in. He faced the back wall, counted out the steps, and pressed his palm flat. The first tap spoke in the dull syllable of solid concrete. The second tap answered with a thinner sound, a suggestion the wall was not all wall. He knelt, measured with his fingers, 12 inches in from the corner, for down, and felt metal where stone should have been. The rusted handle resisted in the way old doors resist people who don't belong, then gave with a slick, tiny click that snapped the room's stillness. The panel slid, grudging and surprised, and a breath of air slipped past his face. Dry, cool, old paper and tool oil. The crawlspace angled steeply, a throat tightening toward a deeper body. Concrete gave way to packed earth and scraped stone, surfaces shaved and tamped by hands that believed in repetition. He moved on his forearms, ribs brushing ribs of the passage, the flashlight's cone catching scuffs and a single bent nail, incongruous and intimate. When the tunnel widened, the light opened into a space he couldn't name at first. A room, a burrow, a patient. The floor wore a circle of soil that looked smoothed rather than swept, darker than the rest, as if heat had polished it. Noah crouched at the edge and felt, with the irrational certainty that follows grief around, that something had once rested right there long enough to alter the ground's memory. The beam snagged on a glint half buried at the circle's rim. He lifted a small badge from the dirt, the plastic cracked, the clip furred with orange. J. Harper, the letters insisted, the kind of insistence cheap laminate makes when it wants to outlast the job. He didn't say Joel's name out loud. He only held the badge until the temperature of its past agreed to the temperature of his palm, then slid it into an evidence envelope he had brought out of habit and a need to do at least one thing right. He worked the perimeter of the chamber, short steps, slow, reading the walls with the light as if they had lines for him. Scratches ran in thin, parallel bursts shoulder-high and lower, desperate marks made by a metal edge gone dull. Nothing else spoke. A broken crate half swallowed by dirt, a glass bottle collapsed into a glittering rind. The air was wrong in a way his body understood better than his brain. It had weight without scent, like a note held under a piano lid long after the pianist lifted his hands. He retreated in careful reverse, counting breaths and inches, and slid the panel shut. The click sounded final, but it felt like etiquette. Back at the motel, he layered the stormwater map from 1951 against a newer parcel plan and traced the line of the old secondary access under the station. East of the slab, the draftsman's neat script left a rectangle blank, a cavity with no doors drawn, labeled only DNR2 and a weary penciled warning, "Do not dig." He measured the distance with a carpenter's stubbornness, then returned to the site just before 3 in the morning when work lights were off and the lot remembered itself. The old canopy had collapsed years ago, but the footings remained, for square posts like the corners of a narrow stage. He paced the count from the map toward the eastern footing and let his boot heel knock a different tone from the ground. He cleared the gravel with his hands and found a steel plate set so flush it might as well have been a thought. No hinges, no handle, just the thin argument of a seam. Leverage is a language farm kids keep even when they move away. He wedged a wrecking bar into the seam and leaned the way you lean when you mean it. The plate shifted with a groan he felt in his teeth. Dry air climbed out and died against July. He lifted enough to set it aside, knees shaking with the plain fact of resistance, and put his head over the opening. A ladder descended into a darkness with a structure to it, the kind of dark that belongs to clean rooms and locked boxes. He went down one rung at a time, keeping a hand on the rail and a name in his mouth that he didn't say. The chamber below was not concrete. It was engineered. Thin metal ribs ran the walls at even intervals, a precise cage that told him somebody had drawn this on paper before they gave it to the earth. The floor dust lay untroubled, a velvet of time. Against the far wall, a chair had been bolted to the slab, cuffs lolling from its arms like spent tongues, a spotlight halo dead above it. Beside the chair, a narrow table held what was left of a notebook, pages glued by damp and years. He coaxed one free and read block letters that looked carved into the paper rather than written. Do not speak to it. Do not answer. If it remembers your name, leave immediately. Below, in a different hand, cramped and shaky, responds to names, places, smells. Acknowledgement speeds it up. He aimed the light behind the chair and saw 2 marks scratched into the metal, careful and undeniable. V and beneath, we weren't alone. He stood there long enough to hear the old fear practicing his uncle's voice, then turned the light back toward the ladder and understood the wrongness in his bones. This room wasn't built to store, it was built to hold. The silence pressed close, as if waiting to see if he'd answer back. Noah found Travis Benton at the edge of the backyard, where the grass surrendered to a narrow strip of river stones Carl had laid decades earlier to keep the mud off his boots. The porch light burned though the afternoon didn't need it, a habit survivors learn when time turns slippery. Travis was lean and careful, the kind of man who looked like he'd been practicing goodbyes for years. He didn't invite Noah in. He didn't shut the door either. "If you came to ask whether my father built any of it," he said, "he didn't." The words were flat, practiced, and they left more unsaid than they answered. Noah kept his hands visible, palms empty, and said he'd come to understand why a town could love 3 men and still choose concrete over questions. Travis's gaze moved once to the road, once to the house, and settled on a point over Noah's shoulder as if watching a storm form where the sky was still blue. They sat at a patio table bleached by Kansas sun. Travis talked in the pauses between the wind chimes. "He knew about the room," he said at last. "Not the second. The first. He said it had been there before he took the station, before the last owner even. He tried to keep people out of it. He told the boys to leave it alone. He told me to leave it alone." He rubbed his thumb along a scar at the base of his hand. Sometimes keeping something shut is the only kindness you can afford. Noah heard the sentence and its hidden age. He thought of the panel, the click, the air trying not to remember itself. When Noah asked about the night in '82, Travis looked toward the fence, a glance more reflex than choice. "He gave them a chance to walk away," he said. "Sometimes that's all you can do. One chance. And then the world decides." The line hurt because of its grammar, someone acting, someone acted upon, but Noah recognized how grief writes people into passive voice. "Who else knew?" he asked. "Enough," Travis answered, which is a number towns use when they plan not to count. The envelope arrived at Noah's motel that evening, slid under the door as if the carpet could bless it. No return address, just his name in thin block letters that admitted nothing. Inside lay a photocopy stamped confidential, dated October 18, 1982. The memo's tone was bureaucratic the way a drain is practical. It did its job and refused to speak of the smell. It confirmed a third inspection at the station had found no new evidence, acknowledged the original entry chamber, but declined to explore beyond ground level, and, most sharply, recorded a recommendation: seal the chamber with reinforced concrete, issue no press release, transfer the deed to the county to discourage urban exploration and future liability. Noah read it twice and felt the particular cold that comes when secrecy isn't a mistake but a decision with a file number. He took the memo to Whitaker's kitchen, where the retired cop kept folders in a drawer that used to hold potholders. The old man listened, then stood, limped to a cupboard, and returned with a fixed-point photograph. Foundation work at the station in 1970, men in hard hats, rebar in rows. At the bottom of the image, half swallowed by shadow, lay a hatch set into the earth, same dimensions, same cut, before a single yard of slab was poured. "I tried to show this to my captain," Whitaker said. "He told me I was seeing what I wanted to see. Men love to accuse you of that when it keeps them from looking." Noah traced the rectangle's edge with a fingertip and understood in one motion both the stubbornness that had kept Whitaker angry all these years and the relief of being right too late. Back at the blue stem, Noah arranged his notes into a map that wasn't geography so much as a ledger of choices. He wrote down names and dates and then crossed out the parts that were simply pain pretending to be data. He copied the tapes. He left one set with Whitaker, one with a friend out of state, and kept a third with him because sometimes the only safe place for truth is the pocket closest to your body. He recorded a log entry he didn't want to narrate: the room, the chair, the instructions, the voice on side B. He didn't describe the second chamber's ladder or the way the metal ribs seemed to narrow when you breathed. Some details belong to the private whether a story leaves in you. He drove once more past the Sunoco lot, slowed by habit, and imagined the town's years of living with a locked door below its routines. You could call it cowardice. You could call it prudence. He suspected it was the bargain community's strike when they fear that the answer will demand more than they can pay. A single question followed his car to the interstate and climbed in. What do you owe the dead when the living still need the ground to be steady? He didn't open the hatch again. He didn't need to. He had learned what kind of silence this was. Lesson: curiosity begins the search, but responsibility draws the line. Truth matters, Yet so do the lives that must go on when the ground remembers more than we can safely know.